we're here today with Phil Isenberg, Jimmie Yee, and Donna Yee, and I'm Judi King. And we're continuing the story of the beginnings of ACC. So I'm wondering whether you can, both of you, can tell us how you first got involved with ACC and the beginnings of the conversations about starting the nursing home. Phil.
It was either Chuy Ito or Isla Collin or Bob Matsui who mentioned to me first that there was some big commotion going on about doing something that might be a building or might not be a building, but it was really good. And the starting discussion was Japanese American primarily, and then later, and I can't remember how much later, it became Asian, with the settlement of the suspicions between Chinese Americans and Japanese Americans about whether they should do it jointly or separately. But I can't remember the first contact. But Bob and I had been elected to the city council in 1971. So we were 4 months into our term when ACC started in the planning stages. And you were there.
Where was that?
well, I don't know. Maybe it was Chuy's garage, but the discussions went on. And let's see, I think the first building was in the 1980s, early 80s. I think that's right. And the planning and the commotion and the fundraising was, continuous all the time.
So you kind of touched my memory a little bit, because it was Bob Matsui who first came to talk to me about getting involved. And I should remember back then, the Japanese community and the Chinese community was totally separated. They had their own churches, their own sports league. We had our family gatherings and our own sports. And that's how it was with the senior citizens. But as we grew up, our generation, we became more acclimated to each other. And I'm glad it is, because it's what it is today. The Asian community, not the Japanese community, not the Chinese community.
Phil, you made some reference of meeting in Chuy's, what was it, garage?
Well, you know from earlier videos that Chuy Ito was, I don't know, think of superlative comments about Chuy, who could also be grumpy and argumentative at times. But he was one of, and maybe some people would argue, and I'd argue, the most important element of keeping this thing in not in order. Chuy was not a great believer in order or discipline, but he liked to progress, and he likes to settle a discussion and settle an issue and raise some money and start a program and lord over the program. And he was also active in politics outside the ACC framework. And so I can't remember who talked to me first, but it was either Chuy or Bob, or maybe later Isla Collin, even before she became a county supervisor.
Wow.
Yeah, actually, that's how I got started. Not because of Chuy, because I didn't know Chuy back then, but it was because of Bob Matsui.
Right.
Bob and I are very close because we went to the same social activities. That he belonged to the 2030 Club, and eventually he became our company counsel, legal counsel. So I knew Bob pretty well, and he's the one that got me involved into this project, which is so-called nursing home.
And at that time, were you mainly doing engineering? Were you involved in politics at that time?
Not in politics, no. That's the furthest from my mind. I was trying to get my business going, and that's where I was at that time. Yeah, no politics.
Jimmie's a big deal engineer. I mean, he always has been. He's done major projects, worked on this, and I would be shocked if you didn't have to intervene with city planning officials at one time or another on one of these buildings. You don't have to say anything, but you're smiling and looking guilty. So
that's
it's
all part
plausible.
of being
Yeah.
on the council and on the board of supervisor,
Right.
because all these big projects come before you, have to say yay or nay, one way or the other. But anytime you make a decision, you better have a good reason as to why you're doing it.
Wow.
So when Bob came to you, it was partly because of your professional skills as an engineer and partly because you're a leader in the community?
Well, I appreciate those comments, but I was just starting to get into community affairs, and you know, when you're starting a business, you only have so much time. But
Right.
he's the one that got me interested in that, being more active in the community.
Was it a hard sell?
No, not the hard sell. You know, Bob Matsui, he can talk you into doing anything.
What were some of the, you've mentioned all these people that were involved. What were some of the first steps that you, I guess, an informal group? I don't know. How formal was the group?
The way I looked at it was informal sort of all the way, because we had no established organization.
Okay.
And like you say, Chewy was very active, and he got his own group together. And
Right.
eventually, Bob reached out to myself and the Chinese community. And I think, you know, looking back, the nursing home and its predecessors was the one thing that got the Japanese community and the Chinese community together, because our elders weren't seeing eye to eye because of the war. And we can
Oh, of
understand
course.
that.
Yeah.
But we're the younger generation, you know, we get to know each other a lot more on a social basis. And so,
And all the kids and the grandkids were intermarrying and not paying any attention to their elders.
That's right.
Yes, so that helped too.
yes.
Wow. So what were some of those first steps that this informal group took that led towards the beginnings of the nursing home and ACC?
The way I look back at it is, I have to pinpoint it right down to Bob Matsui. You know, when you're in politics, you get to meet a lot of people, a lot of business people, a lot of developers. And fortunately, Bob Matsui had the opportunity to meet with Angelo Sakopoulos. Angelo is one of those big-time donors to the Greek community. But he didn't think only of the Greek community, because when Bob went to talk to him, I wasn't in on the discussion between Bob and Angelo, but I assumed that during the discussions that it went from what started out as a housing project into a nursing home.
Oh.
That's how I looked at it. But because Bob eventually stepped away from the council and moved on to the assembly,
Right.
he was in and out of Sacramento so much, Chewy became a big part of the coordination, because he knew all the background, he knew the Japanese community, and he through some of us get to know the Chinese community better. And so I have to hand it to Chewy to pick up the glove and move on to where we're at today.
So was it hard to start out, if there was a lot of discussion around housing and then it moved towards the nursing home? Was that a hard discussion in the community?
No, I don't think it was, because in my younger days, like everyone, when you're young, you don't think about what happens when you're getting older. Today, when I look back, I'm glad we did what we did, and I'm glad what you did, Donna, because you're the big part, as far as I'm concerned, in going from the nursing home to the housing to assisted living, and then to dementia. And then on top of that, Meals on Wheels. I mean, ACC today, you can't improve on it. I mean, they've done so much. I think everyone in the United States should look upon ACC and you, Donna, as how you start from scratch and taking it to where we're at today. I thank you from the bottom of my heart, really.
Thank you. You're too generous. So I know that, you know, developing a nursing home is a totally different thing than working on housing. It almost took a whole different crew of people.
Yes.
So was there a lot of outreach and sort of finding different experts or different kinds of money? I mean, because they're funded differently?
Well, from my perspective, all I can remember is that when we started going out to fundraise, it had nothing to do with housing because the project we wanted was the nursing home.
Right.
And it's great because it affects all of the senior citizens in our community. And of course, if you look at the younger generation of seniors, who had the money? Not the young kids, it's their parents.
Yeah.
And they can understand and see eventually we might need to be in a nursing home. And so even though it's not an easy sell, it was something that people was very interested in.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
speaking of raising money, between Chu and I, we talked about how to go out and raise money. In order to ask people for money, you have to be upfront yourself. How much are you going to put in?
Right.
So just between Chu and I, we agreed to put up $2,500 at that time.
Wow.
You know, it's a lot of money now, but back then it was huge.
Yeah.
And so with that as an incentive, whenever we went, or whenever I went out to raise money, they would ask, how much would you put in? That was something that I could go back on, and
Yeah.
they could either put more or even less, either way. But it was a talking point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And so were you the one who got Dr. Fong involved?
Well, I wouldn't say I got him involved because he is my brother-in-law. And he's a medical doctor. He knows essentially how important a nursing home is. And without too much discussion and urging, yeah, he became involved. In fact, I'm glad he did because he was so active with AC,
Right.
eventually becoming the chief medical officer for how long? 20 years?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
You mentioned that there was, when we were talking before a little bit, that there was a major catalyst, that was your word, a catalyst that made, that really moved this group, this informal group forward. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, I looked at it as a major catalyst, and anytime you have an idea and try to sell it to the public, you need something to show them, from what I look back at. And what can you show them except something on paper? That doesn't prove that you're going to do it. So looking back, I think that Bob Matsui's discussion with Angelo, which eventually led to Angelo donating land, in my mind, was the major catalyst in getting this project moving. That wasn't the only thing, but it was the start. And I'm glad he did, because now we could go out and talk to our public and say, here's what we got, but we need more. And listening to the story about why we need it, it wasn't too hard to sell the project. People knows that we need it, and we need financing.
And then I guess, were you part of the group that reached out to people just to figure out the financing part, right? Because it was several millions of dollars to build the nursing home. So I guess there were individuals and companies that got involved.
I had left to go to the legislature by that time, but my impression was when Angelo made his decision, let's see, he donated land, contributed cash, it was all part of the pocket. And the pocket area, this area we're in today, before World War II was farmed largely by Greek Americans and by Japanese American farmers. And Angelo had a really strong nostalgic identification with the pocket. He was also developing the hell out of it.
Yeah.
And the merger of interest of land developers with charitable activities comes because if you allow and permit and encourage nonprofit and charitable activities as part of a land development, public officials tend to look upon that as a really big benefit, making not easy, but easier the processing of applications for residential housing and shopping centers and all the stuff that's in the pocket
You
today.
made me feel like you talk about me, because that's exactly how I felt. You know, when the
Yeah.
developer comes in, he has a larger piece of property, but he wants to donate land for a charitable. It makes it easier for us to make that decision, because it isn't only for money with him, but he's spending money for the community.
Right. The advantage you have with Angelo is he has a wide philanthropic interest in a variety of subject matters: history, Greek culture. He's even into environmental issues, although he gets in fights with environmentalists every once in a while.
Yeah.
But that opened, I think, to ACC and the Asian community a connection to a well-established immigrant community, and with Angelo as an example, very successful, highly educated, highly motivated, really smart, and it turned out substantially wealthy.
Right.
And so the chemistry seemed to work. Bob was a big part of it. Bob was a sweetheart to deal with. His ego's under control. He got mad once every 75 years. I mean, he was just a thoroughly decent person. And so the chemistry worked out. The expressions and the decisions at a distance, my feeling was, oh hell, people were just winging it, just like you normally do in politics or land development or anything. And these big decisions, in retrospect, probably were minor points along. And I've still never figured out who made the decision to go for a nursing home first, and when, and why, and where. And I suspect we'll never get an answer to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But some people are saying that when the Republican administration started defunding housing programs, that's when people in the community said, well, what other kinds of buildings would meet the needs in the community? And that's when people started thinking about a nursing home, because it was possible to not rely on federal funding, but to do more local fundraising. And I guess that's how, I don't know who introduced ACC to the state Cal mortgage program or
I suspect
bond
it
funding.
was Bob significantly, but a lot of people did at the same time. The other thing to remember is, in politics, senior citizens are safe, meaning they don't offer any political disadvantage. That's why you see senior housing built much faster than housing for lower income, younger people. And so it's a agreed upon good, agreed upon need, even if distant in the future when we were younger. And it helps in dealing with state or federal bureaucrats who administer programs, because you have a coalition that's built around diverse interest. So the Greek community is not just a democratic institution, political institution. Angelo's currently a prominent Democrat, but he used to be a college Republican, and a lot of the Greek Americans that operate in Sacramento are Republicans. But that's a positive on a project you're developing.
Right.
It's like Jimmie's point on getting the Chinese community and Japanese community to think of the Asian community is a powerful selling point to a larger world.
Yes.
Was the Greek, I'll say, housing, the senior housing next, which is
The Hellenic Center?
Was it there already when
Yes.
he donated the land?
Yes.
So was that a major connection for him, or a major reason that he wanted that land to be donated to ACC, because of the presence of the Hellenic Center?
Well, the fact that he had donated the land for the Greek community housing
Right.
made it a lot more convenient for Angelo to consider the land adjacent to it to donate to the nursing home. That was the primary reason. Of course, I think a lot of has to do with the Asian and Japanese, Chinese community wanting it to be located where it's at because it's central.
Yes.
We no longer had a Chinatown or a Japantown back down there in Old Town.
Yeah.
We all moved out here into this area. And so that was the main reason why this was a very excellent location for the location of the nursing home.
Yeah.
Was there a reason, you just said that everybody, quote, moved into this general pocket Greenhaven area. Why was that?
Well, back in the 50s, I still remember redevelopment. My dad had a store located at 4th and Capitol. We lived at 7th and N Street. And for whatever reason, they wanted to redevelop the whole area, not block by block.
Right.
They cleared out the whole West End. And so it forced the Japanese community, who was down there in West End, and the Chinese community to move out. And most of us moved out into this area. It's, in fact, I have to say, back then they had restrictions on where the Asians can buy property. And so we had to work through that loop.
Right. They had land covenants until the 60s.
Well,
Yeah.
they enforced the land covenants, but that eventually dropped out. But most of the covenants are still left in title documents.
Right.
Really?
It's very costly to amend a title to remove some language. And so you have anti-Jewish language, anti-Asian language, anti-Black American in title documents that's still around on paper, but
Yes.
unenforceable.
Wow,
Yeah.
Says a lot about the culture of the time. So.
Yeah.
amazing.
Yeah. So during the time that once the project of the nursing home got started and people were getting on board, what were some of the big things that happened? Were there some roadblocks? Were there some particular problems that happened?
You mean after or before it got started?
When it was in the development, because I sort of had understood that it took like almost 10 years before the doors opened at the nursing home.
Well,
So in those, like between 84 and 87, were there some things happening?
One of the things that we in the Asian community realized right off the bat, when your mom or dad or grandparents have to go to a nursing home, many of them didn't speak English.
Right.
The diet is totally different.
Yeah.
And so those two items are big things to think about. And I think that's why the desire to have an Asian nursing home was a primary driving force. However, today with the nursing home the way it is, it's open to everyone.
Right.
And that's good, but at least they provide the proper diet to those who need it and speak their language.
Was Dr. Fong involved at the very beginning?
I think he was, yes. I mean, after he was involved long before it opened up, but I have to hand it to Dr. Fong because he was one of the pioneer medical person. He's one of the first Chinese medical doctor to practice, and I admire him for everything he did because he worked long and hard and got involved not only in the Asian community but also in his professional society.
Right. Wasn't he the first Chinese to be the head of the Medical Society of Sacramento Valley?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, and then what else? He used to come on, I think it was Wednesdays. Every Wednesday on his way home, he would stop by my office. So I was really lucky. He would tell me different stories, and one of the stories he told me was how he was one of the first physicians to start a multi-level practice. Because at that time in Sacramento, the cardiologists were like separate doing their own thing, and the general practice people were, and he he recruited a lot of different disciplines into a practice together, a group practice. And I think this is also where it encouraged more physicians to admit their patients to the nursing home, the Asian nursing home. Asians, but not just Asians. And I think that made a big difference too, because if you don't have any referral sources, you know, you're just a building sitting there.
What are the stories behind your fundraising, for goodness sakes?
My story was based on need. And every time I just tried to ask for money, I said, one of the days you may need it. And you know, it isn't hard to have them contribute money when they know that they potentially could be a patient. That was my story as far as going forward. And at the same time, say, even though Angelo donated the land, we needed financing to add to it.
Then, of course, ACC had no assets. I mean, it was a community group trying to get a project started. So it must have had a hard time going to banks, too.
Well, I'm just guessing, but the first 10 years, before you had a building, before you had land, before you had a building site, before you had plans, was just a real pain in the neck to raise money.
Yeah.
It's just the hope of something. So people like the mayor here put together the starting funding before the public money was available. The public money, you had to show you had land, or you showed you have cash, or showed you had city or county approval for a particular project. And that then led to the more organized efforts that came, in the 1980s. Matter of fact, I sent you that groundbreaking photograph from the center from, I think, 1983, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, I can't remember the date.
Somebody who looked very much like you, a younger you, was in that picture.
I think so.
I'm not sure, but you have better memory than I have.
I think it was the groundbreaking. Weren't you there at the groundbreaking?
Yeah, he was standing there.
Of course he was there.
And some people were holding up signs. Chewy was at one end.
Yeah.
And I think you were at the other end and not holding up the signs. And that was it. No shovels, no golden shovels. No. That was different. But if you look for your staging, it's the first loose organization that starts in the 70s. It becomes slightly more structured as it goes on. It linked up through Bob Matsui with Angelo and with the land in the pocket where a lot of people were living, near where a lot of Asian Americans were living. And, you know, then whenever Angelo donated the land, whatever particular point, he made an announcement first, and I'll bet you the land wasn't donated legally until some years later after you'd gotten city building approval for plans and schematics and all that kind of stuff. And so it sounds like it was easy, but it can't have been easy. It can't. It's a major achievement to see what ACC is today and realize it started from a bunch of young guys who were sitting around saying, well, we ought to do something, or get drafted by a newly elected city councilman who had Bob Matsui, who had a good line to sell. So,
wow.
Thank you.
So establishing some of these allies was through the people you've just mentioned, or how did you reach out to the wider community?
Well, in order to reach out, you just reach out to all your friends to begin with. But you know, when you reach out to 10 friends, they in turn reach out to another 10. It just balloons. If you have a good project, that's how it happened. It just ballooned.
I was just wondering how this group managed to spread the word so effectively and so thoroughly without what we now depend on, these days depend on, social media and all of that.
You could just see in some of the people like Chewy Ito in his little gas station on Riverside Boulevard was kind of a social center for the young Japanese Americans right after World War II. And they would just do things, and Chewie would just do things. And when you got involved, you brought connections to a bunch of then young professionals who were starting to accumulate a reasonable amount of money as their career advanced, and Jimmie freed them of some of their money.
Well, it's sort of that way, but you know, when you reach out to your friends, they and their parents belong to all different organizations.
Right.
So it's not just reaching your friends, but their friends' organization.
Okay.
It just opens up to a whole broad spectrum of who those donors could be.
Yeah, and although there's always competition for raising money, you go to the Buddhist church downtown, you go to the Florin church, you go to the JACL, you go to where there are established connections.
Yes.
Right.
Yes, that.
And those connections eventually lead to, hopefully, meetings, small meetings, one-on-one. That's Jimmie's specialty, but also small events.
Yes.
And I don't know, I can't remember all the events I attended as mayor, but I think I did 500 events one year when I was young and really crazy. And a couple of those were probably fundraisers for, if not ACC, for some version of ACC. And you know, what you've got now is a very sophisticated, very complicated, very elaborate, and highly motivated empire down here. I mean, this is this is a big deal. It's a big deal. And it started off with a bunch of guys in the gas station and people like Jimmie who got involved in the project, and they brought their connections with them and their energy and their time and their talent, and it worked.
Wow. Here's the other thing that I was thinking of is, you know, a lot of people who do community organizing, they would go to the organization, get the organization to adopt the project, and then that would be like the key to everything. But it seems to me that in Sacramento and in this community, the key was people talking to all of their friends and relatives. And by virtue of a lot of people in a church supporting the project, the church supported the project. And the church governance didn't have to take an action. It's not like they were asked to say, yes, we support the nursing home or not. Because I think even in the early days, it's really the members of the churches more than the churches themselves that became the donors.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I think it's very different in that way. I think, you know, when I went to college, you know, one of the things we were taught about community organizing is you go to the organizations, you get the organizations to support you. But I think in ACC's experience, it was really about going to individuals in the community. Yeah. The project resonated with those people, and the support sort of swelled up. It's a really different model.
I'd argue to you that if you were looking for seminal points along the path, the interest of Isla Collin in ACC and Asian American stuff generally, for that almost 20-year period when she was on the Board of Supervisors, she would do endless little things to help. She'd be at every single event, always, but she carried the message. She must have bothered other supervisors about things like this. And that was a tool that you got from a single individual who committed her time and her interest to further development of the project. That's a big deal.
Right. Because I think in those days, too, it wasn't like ACC, the organization, contacting somebody who had an elected office because of the office. It was really individuals who knew each other. And I think over the years now, it's been since 1987 that the nursing home was open. A lot of us would really be surprised to realize how many of our own family members or people that we know in the community have been served at the nursing home. So has that changed your idea about from the early days, from '87 to date, sort of what the nursing home has accomplished or what the meaning of that has been?
Yes, I hear what you're saying. Back in my younger days, we didn't think about what happens when you become a senior. But I have seen a big change, because in our older days, the Asians, talking about Japanese and the Chinese, we always took care of our parents.
Right.
Always. That was the one thing that was the most important. But over time, as the younger generation grew up, their perspective is a little different. But I'm lucky my kids aren't that way. They still take good care of me. But nevertheless, sometimes it gets to a point where your parents are more than you can control. And that's a real problem. When you get elderly, the elderly needs a lot of attention, and sometimes even medical attention. That's something the family can't provide.
Right.
And that's what changes the perspective of what it used to be, because in the old days, the kids just took care of their parents, grandparents. Today, they take care of them as much as they can, but they reach a point where they just can't handle it anymore, and that's why ACC has become so important.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then to partner up with the families, not to take the place of.
Right.
And I think in our community, that's really clear. In the old days when people were studying gerontology, older people and programs, they were all talking about how families would, abandon their elders. But I think in this particular community, the fact that there are so many days that in the dining room there are as many family members as there are residents in our buildings is a testament to sort of the partnering up between the families and the people who need care, extra care.
Yes.
That was I experienced that because both of my parents were at the nursing home, and since we are not Asian, I'm wondering if the Asian community and the cultural aspects, the food, the language, that was crucial. But you made the point that it still is open to everyone, and I just wondered if Phil, if you had maybe a different take on, besides the family that Jimmie brought up, on the I would say the process of aging and how you see it differently now.
Well, I'm old now.
Then when you saw it at the beginnings of the nursing home, is your perspective different in terms of what the needs are, for example?
Well, at the beginning, when you're young and when your parents and relatives are still relatively young, you don't think about it.
Right.
But as everybody gets older, you start to think about what'll happen when we lose things. I'm using hearing aids. I've used glasses since I was a kid. You get creakier as you get older. Your mental memory is not as good. There are just a lot of things that go on. And so having a place like ACC is a very useful reminder that there are ways to deal with aging that are sensitive, that do not depend entirely on the family.
Right.
But particularly, one of the strengths of ACC is encouraging the involvement of family. And the other are the little projects, the projects I like. We were talking earlier before this filming started about the jelly jars, which I forgot to bring to drop off today, the used ones. But that raises a little bit of money, but it's an activity for some mostly women who are really good at making jelly and jam. But it's also a feeling of community.
Right.
And it's that community which makes sense. So I suspect that models like ACC are going to be more and more developed as the society in which we live, American society. The population is aging.
Right.
And we tend to not like that in the abstract, but it's true. And that the need for ACC-like services will only increase as time goes on.
But that's one of the good things about ACC over the years, and I could see you developing it. It started new programs, because as you move along, you notice that, hey, we need this, we need that, and that. And one of the best things that you ever did was talk to Dr. William Fong about improving the education of some of the nursing help. And not everyone was a registered nurse. In order to become a registered nurse, they need education. And so I'm glad that when my nephew came out from New York, that he believed in what I was telling him, how good ACC was. And so he stepped up and said, okay, I'll help, and donated $100,000 to create the education fund.
Yes.
And I think that has helped a lot as far as improving some of the nursing help that you have so they can step up the ladder.
Exactly. And having the confidence that we could do that year after year, not just one time. And then the other thing that the fund does is it helps us talk with individuals about the different paths they want to take to improve their skills. So it's not just one training program. It's really helping individuals go back to school or train or get different kinds of training in different ways. So it's really, I think, a lot of foresight. Because on the one hand, of course, some of the staff might say, you know, the administrators might say, oh yeah, then we train them and then they move somewhere else and they go work for Sutter Hospital or something, right? But in fact, we have had so many people over the years start at ACC, get training, go somewhere else, and then come back, and come back in leadership positions. And we've had some people basically grow up in ACC. We have a staff member who said, you know, a few days after I arrived in the US, I came to ACC and it's the first and only place I've ever worked. And they've had like 20 different job descriptions over, over the almost 40-something years. So I think this is where, you know, the support of professional development for the staff is really so important, and the support from the community, from your family, from so many family members of residents, especially at the nursing home, is really, really important. You know, sometimes people say, well, you know, what is it? I mean, in the old days when we used to talk about quality of care in places like nursing homes, people used to say, oh, you go in and you just do the smell test and that's how you know if a place is providing good care. But actually there are so many elements, and support from your family, from the community, to support the staff development is really as important. So thank you. You know, this is an enduring gift. And even, you know, your nephew, he can be so contrarian, but he really challenges us.
He is. He does.
You know, Dr. Ng can really challenge us to think about things. And many times, you know, he's asked me questions that I had never thought of. And he has a belligerent way of asking the question, so it's like, be tough, you know. But it's that kind of input and that kind of support that really helps ACC grow and develop. So,
But, you know,
Well,
Dr. John Ng, who's my nephew, thought so much of ACC that one day we started talking about what kind of entertainment does the patients have. We had no entertainment. And so he and his family decided that, okay, we'll set up another fund. And I'm glad he donated another $100,000 to create a fund to help some of the social programs pay for some of the little expenses.
yes.
But,
both of those programs that he helped with and funded has helped in general to make ACC the family that all of you have referred to over our conversation here. So Oh, I have to thank everyone in the community that has helped make it a community and sort of make it a family too, which has been, all of you, thank you, particularly you, Phil, and you, Jimmie, for the time that you have given us and some of the stories that you've contributed that we were really unaware of.
I never told you the story about Jimmie dancing on top of a table at one time at a party, and the police had to be called. Oh, I'm sorry, that was a different Jimmie.
Anyway, thank you.
An
all of
honor to
you.
be here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you.